The doors of Baltimore came off their hinges before anyone had time to scream. 2 in the morning, June 20th, 1631. The southwest coast of Ireland. The smell in the air was peat smoke drifting up from dying hearths. The last ordinary smell these people would ever know in their own homes. Then something else cut through it. Sulfur. Burning thatch. The acrid chemical bite of torches being thrust into straw roofs. And then beneath the screaming that followed, a sound that no one who heard it ever forgot. The rhythmic thud of bare feet on wooden planks. The rowing boats being loaded. Each footfall carrying someone a little further from the shore. Each step the last one that would ever touch Irish soil. More than 200 armed men had crossed over 1,000 miles of open ocean for this. They had studied the layout of this village. They knew which doors lacked heavy bolts. They had moved in absolute silence through the lanes until the signal came. And then everything happened at once. By the time a neighbor on the hill fired a musket and beat a drum to raise the alarm, the ships were already moving away from shore. 107 people, at least, were gone. Most of them were women and children. This was the Sack of Baltimore, the largest Barbary slave raid ever conducted on the soil of Ireland or Britain. And the man who led it was not a stranger from a distant empire. He was a Dutchman who had once sailed under the same flags as the people he now enslaved. A neighbor in the broadest sense, which makes what happened that night not just an atrocity, but a particular kind of betrayal. Of the 107 people taken from Baltimore, only 3 ever returned to Ireland. 3. The rest were swallowed by a world that had been running this operation for over a century. A world of markets and ledgers and administrative entries that reduced human beings to line items. Tonight we are pulling those line items back out of the archive and giving them the name they always deserved: people. And we are asking the question that every European government avoided for 200 years. Why did no one come to save them? To understand what the women of Baltimore walked into, you first have to understand the system waiting for them on the other side of the ocean. The Barbary corsairs were not reckless outlaws chasing adventure on the high seas. They were professionals, operating inside one of the most efficient economic systems of the 17th century. The corsairs ran their operations from fortified port cities along the North African coast, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and the Atlantic stronghold of Salé in Morocco. Each city was a semi-autonomous military republic, nominally under the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul, but governed in practice by councils of corsair captains and military commanders. The guilds controlled everything: ship allocation, raid planning, slave distribution, ransom negotiation. Every layer took its cut. Governors collected taxes on every human being sold. Admirals received a share of every raid's proceeds. The Sultan in Istanbul received his tribute. This was not random violence. It was an industry, precise, hierarchical, and deeply profitable. Between 1530 and 1780, historian Robert C. Davis of Ohio State University estimates that somewhere between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were captured and enslaved by the Barbary corsairs. In the peak decades of the mid-17th century, the corsairs were capturing an estimated 8,000 to 9,000 new European slaves every year just to maintain stable numbers in Algiers alone. The scale of this operation is almost impossible to hold in your mind. The coastlines of Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, England, and Ireland were all systematically targeted. In some regions of southern Italy and Spain, entire stretches of coastline were abandoned for generations. Villages emptied, fishing economies destroyed, whole communities moving inland to escape a sea that no longer meant prosperity. It meant disappearance. The corsairs' reach extended far beyond the Mediterranean. In 1544, the Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa swept through Italy, seizing somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 people from the island of Lipari alone in a single campaign. In 1551, Ottoman corsair Dragut enslaved the entire population of the Maltese island of Gozo, between 5,000 and 6,000 people, in a single raid. In 1554, Vieste in Spain, 6,000 taken. The Balearic Islands in 1558, 4,000. These were not isolated incidents. They were quarterly entries in a ledger that stretched for centuries. And then came the game changer. Around 1600, European renegades, men from England, the Netherlands, and elsewhere who had crossed over and joined the trade, brought something to the corsairs that changed the geography of terror entirely. European-built deep-sea ships capable of crossing the open Atlantic. For the first time, nowhere was safe. In 1627, just 4 years before Baltimore, Murad Reis himself led a raid on the island of Heimaey in Iceland. Around 400 people were seized from settlements so remote that the concept of North African pirates would have been essentially meaningless to them. The corsairs had turned the entire Atlantic seaboard into their hunting ground. Which brings us to the man standing on the deck of a 300-ton Dutch-built warship off the coast of West Cork on a June night in 1631. Murad Reis the Younger, born January Janzoen van Haarlem, in the Dutch city of Haarlem around 1570. He had begun his career as a legitimate Dutch privateer during the 80 Years' War. Then in 1618, captured off the Canary Islands, he converted to Islam and switched sides so completely that within a decade he commanded a corsair fleet from Salé, Morocco. He once sailed his corsair ships directly into his old Dutch home port of Veer to resupply, and the Dutch authorities were powerless to stop him because of a freshly signed peace treaty. He sailed away, provisioned by the same town where he had grown up. That was the kind of man who came to Baltimore. Here is where the story becomes something more than an assault from the outside. Here is where it becomes a betrayal. As Murad's fleet moved up the Irish coast in mid-June 1631, it captured several smaller fishing vessels. One of those vessels was captained by a Dungarvan fisherman named John Hackett. Murad's original target for his land raid was Kinsale, a larger, more prosperous town further up the coast. But a Royal Navy vessel, the 5th Lion's Whelp under Captain Hook, was anchored in Kinsale Harbor. Attacking a fortified port with a warship in it was a different calculation than attacking a sleeping village. Murad needed an alternative. Hackett provided one. John Hackett was not a monster from a distant land. He was a fisherman who knew every cove and channel of the West Cork coastline. He knew Baltimore Harbor well enough to pilot 2 large vessels through its approaches in the dark, silently, without running aground. He knew the village. He may have known which houses had the youngest women, which doors lacked heavy bolts, which inhabitants had no men nearby to defend them. The English settlers who had sent their fishing boats out and left their wives and children behind. He steered Murad away from Kinsale and directly to Baltimore, reportedly in exchange for his own release. The question that haunts this moment is not whether Hackett knew what would happen. He knew exactly what would happen. The corsairs were not in the business of taking prisoners for sport. Every fisherman on the Irish coast in 1631 knew what Barbary raiders did. Hackett made a calculation: his life against theirs, his freedom against their futures. 107 people, maybe more, against one man's survival. Did he lie awake the night before the raid, listening to the sounds of Murad's men checking their weapons and chains, and think about the families sleeping in those cottages? Did he tell himself it was only the English settlers, Protestants, foreigners, people who had taken O'Driscoll land? Did he make himself believe the Irish among them would be spared? There are accounts suggesting Murad did release some of the native Irish captives, which might have been Hackett's private justification. Or it might have been no justification at all, just the arithmetic of desperation. John Hackett was convicted and hanged for his role in the raid. 2 years after it happened, in 1633, he was executed from the cliff above Baltimore Harbor within sight of the cove where his betrayal had been paid for in chains. History records his punishment, but cannot record his reasoning, and that gap is the most unsettling part of his story. Because he was not an aberration, he was a demonstration of something that appears in every chapter of this history, that the machinery of human trafficking cannot function without people on the inside. People who know the territory, who know the faces, who make the mathematics of survival work by pointing at their neighbors and saying, "Take them." More than 200 corsairs went ashore in the dark, moving in two coordinated groups, one toward the cove, the cluster of thatched cottages along the waterfront, the other toward the main village on higher ground. They had Hackett's intelligence. They had the layout. The first thing the villagers registered was not sight, it was sound, the crash of a door, then another, then the particular sound of burning thatch, a soft, fast, hungry crackling that turned to roar within seconds. Those who woke to that sound had only a few heartbeats of confusion before the room filled with the shapes of men they had never seen, speaking languages no one in Baltimore had ever heard, holding torches and muskets in lengths of chain. The official report filed afterward by an Irish official recorded what was taken with blunt precision. 50 youngsters, some still in their cradles, 34 women, nearly 24 men. The corsairs moved fast. They were not interested in silver plate or fishing equipment. Every second on shore was a second closer to the Royal Navy finding out where they were. They swept through the cove, taking everyone they could reach, then moved briefly into the main village before musket fire from William Harris on the hill, followed by the sound of a military drum, caused them to pull back. The drum and the musket together bought the upper village time to flee into the hills. The people of the cove had no hills to run to. Those who were taken were herded to the shore at sword point. Some were bound immediately. Children were separated from mothers. Men were knocked down if they resisted. And then the walk to the boats, barefoot on the shingle, the sea air hitting them for the last time as Irish people, the last smell of salt and cut grass and peat from the extinguishing hearths. The rowing boats pulled away from the shore, the thud of bare feet on the planks, the sound of Baltimore diminishing behind them, the drums still beating, a dog barking, someone on the hill still shouting, until the water took all of it away and there was only the oars and the dark and the open sea. The crossing from the Irish coast to Algiers took 2 to 3 weeks. The hold of a corsair vessel was not built to carry people. The captives were stacked into a space designed for cargo, the ceiling too low to stand, no light, no air except what came through when the hatch opened. Food arrived once or twice a day, hard bread, sometimes water, sometimes nothing. The waste buckets overflowed within the first hours. The smell of sweat, vomit, fear, and the particular decay of a confined space saturated everything. Every surface, every breath. You breathed it while you slept. You woke to it. After a few days, it became simply the smell of consciousness. Women were shackled in groups, wrist to wrist, which meant that when one moved, everyone felt it. When someone died, the body remained chained to the survivors until a guard noticed. These were people who had never traveled more than a few miles from the village where they were born. They had no framework for any of this. The terror of the first hours gave way, over the following days, to something harder still. The deepening understanding that no one was coming. What remained in Baltimore after the ships left was a silence of a particular quality. The fires were still burning. Some houses had been wrecked. The villagers who had fled to the hills came back cautiously at dawn to find the cove emptied. By 1632, reports were already circulating of a planned return attack. The fear was too great. The remaining settlers began leaving. By the end of the decade, Baltimore was essentially a ghost village. Harbors that had once thrummed with the pilchard trade standing quiet, cottages dark, the sea unchanged and indifferent to everything that had happened beside it. In the Ottoman Administrative Archives, she was Asset 402, fair-skinned, age approximately 19, Acquired Algiers, summer 1631. Origin, Franco, the Ottoman bureaucratic shorthand for Western European. Purchase price, noted in the register alongside her acquisition number. But in Baltimore in the weeks before the raid, she was merry. She had a wedding planned, 3 weeks away, perhaps 4. She knew every family on her lane by name. She could tell you which neighbor's chimney smoked badly in wet weather, which fishing boat her father preferred to take out on calm mornings, what the harbor looked like at low tide when the stones went dark with damp. She had a future that was specific and hers, and entirely ordinary in the way that all futures are ordinary until they are taken. We have the tax receipt for her sale. We will never have the sound of her voice again. Sit with that for a moment, not as a rhetorical device, but as a literal fact. Somewhere in the archives, Algerian, Ottoman, possibly transcribed into a European ransom agent's ledger, there is a line of ink that represents her transfer from one owner's property register to another's. A transaction, an asset number, a date. The tax was collected. The bureaucracy processed her correctly and moved on. That ink has survived nearly 400 years. The woman it represents has not left a single word behind. This is the split screen that history books struggle to hold open. The two simultaneous truths of the Barbary slave system. On one side, meticulous Ottoman record-keeping. The corsair operations in Algiers generated enormous amounts of paperwork. Slaves were cataloged, assessed, assigned identification numbers, traded, transferred, and eventually, if they were lucky or wealthy enough to attract ransom, logged out of the system. The archives of Istanbul and Algiers contain tens of thousands of these entries. Dry, efficient, informative in all the ways that matter to an administrator and in none of the ways that matter to a human being. On the other side, the Irish parish records, the ransom petitions, the Sunday morning lists read aloud from the pulpit in Baltimore for years after the raid. Names spoken into a congregation that answered, Amen, and waited, week after week, for those names to come home. The names on the ledger and the names on the pulpit list were the same people. But the Ottoman register did not know about the wedding. The wedding did not know about the register. They existed simultaneously in separate worlds, and the gulf between them is the exact measure of what the Barbary system destroyed. Not just freedom, not just safety, but the specific, irreplaceable weight of a particular life. Historian Robert Davis reconstructed the scale of this trade through these same kinds of cross-referenced records, ransom accounts, shipping logs, and administrative entries, to estimate that somewhere between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were processed through this system between 1530 and 1780. 1 million people, each of them carrying a parallel life that the ledger erased. The tax receipts survive. The voices do not. And that arithmetic, the survival of the paperwork and the destruction of the person, is itself a kind of statement about which things this system was designed to preserve. Pierre Dan, a French Trinitarian priest who worked in Algiers during the 1630s, ransoming captives from Christian nations, left first-hand accounts of the markets that remain among the most vivid primary sources from the entire era. He described Christian women displayed publicly in the main squares of Algiers, examined like livestock by prospective buyers who touched them wherever they chose, ignoring tears and resistance. Women who tried to pull away were beaten in full view of the crowd, not out of cruelty for its own sake, but as a practical demonstration to every other woman on that platform. Your body no longer belongs to you. It belongs to whoever pays the most. The crowd watched. Officials collected their taxes. Children walked past on their way to other errands. None of this happened in back alleys or behind closed doors. It happened in the main squares of functioning cities, in full daylight year after year, as an unremarkable part of ordinary commerce. And somewhere in that market, in the summer of 1631, the women from Baltimore stood on those platforms. women who had weeks earlier been sleeping in thatched cottages in West Cork. Their greatest concerns the weather and the pilchard season, and whether the wedding dress would be finished in time. Now they stood in a North African market square while strangers argued over their price in a language they could not understand, and the tax receipt was written out, and the transaction was completed, and asset 402 was led away from the platform into a world with no exit. The word harem carries centuries of European fantasy, silk cushions, perfumed rooms, exotic mystery. That fantasy was invented by men who had never set foot inside one. The reality, reconstructed from captivity narratives, Ottoman administrative records, and the handful of letters that survived from captive women, was something entirely different. A locked workplace, a domestic prison, and a daily negotiation for survival under a system that had no word for the kind of suffering it produced. Most women sold in the Algerian market went not to great palaces, but to ordinary, wealthy households. In these houses, the majority of female captives performed domestic labor, rising before dawn to light fires, grind grain, haul water, scrub floors, wash clothes, prepare food for extended families. Mistakes brought immediate punishment: burns on bread, a cracked dish, spilled oil. Any of these could mean a beating or a night without food. Illness meant the risk of being resold to a poorer buyer, or simply turned out to survive on the street. The years were long and the work relentless, and the distance from everything familiar was absolute, not just in miles, but in language, in habit, in the basic texture of daily life. Some women survived this for decades. Some were resold multiple times, passing through different cities, different households, different owners, each transaction logged in someone's register, and each one moving them further from any realistic possibility of return. Three patterns appear across the documented accounts of European women in North African captivity, consistent enough to constitute a system. The first was the pressure to convert to Islam. Conversion did not bring freedom. A converted slave remained property, but it opened slightly better paths within the household. Lighter duties, more trusted positions. Refusal brought the reverse: extra labor, reduced food, confinement. Many women resisted for years. Some eventually surrendered outwardly while maintaining their original faith in private, saying Christian prayers in the dark, in Irish or English, under their breath. A hidden self, kept alive in a language no one around them understood. The second pattern was the systematic erasure of language. Orders came in Arabic or Turkish. Failure to understand meant blows. Understanding quickly was the only leverage available. Women who became fluent were slightly more useful, slightly more protected. Those who struggled were labeled stubborn or slow. Over months and years, the original language became something pressed down under the necessity of the new one. Not forgotten exactly, but buried. The third pattern was the one no law interrupted. A European female slave in North Africa had no legal standing. She could not testify against a free person. She could not own property. She could not leave without permission. If she was assaulted by her owner, by his family, by anyone in the household, there was no official channel of complaint. She was, on paper, an object, movable property that could be bought, sold, lent, or given away at her owner's will. This was not an aberration. It was the system functioning exactly as designed, and the courts of Algiers and Istanbul had no interest in revising it. The imperial harem in Istanbul, the most feared destination in the entire system, was a different world again. It occupied a vast complex inside Topkapi Palace. More than 400 rooms, courtyards, gardens, kitchens, baths and corridors so extensive that some women spent years there without setting foot in certain sections. At its height, the imperial harem held between 500 and 1,000 women at once. Most were from the Caucasus, Circassian and Georgian women, who constituted the majority of the Sultan's household. A minority came from further, Russia, Poland, the Balkans, occasionally Western Europe, where they were treated as something like luxury goods, rare, exotic, commanding higher prices. The cold statistical reality of the imperial harem destroys the European fantasy in a single sentence. Even with 500 to 1,000 women living inside the complex, perhaps 50 to 100 over an entire reign would ever have personal contact with the Sultan. A handful would bear his children. The rest spent their lives waiting for a summons that never came. When a sultan died, any woman who had not borne him a child was relocated to a secondary palace called the Old Palace, where former harem women lived out their remaining years. No marriage, no exit, a kind of suspended time between one kind of captivity and death. The Ottoman administrative records occasionally surface an individual from this sea of anonymity. One entry, cited in scholarship on the Topkapi archives, mentions a woman listed as Katerina, identified as of Western European origin, who entered the imperial harem around 1650 and died there in 1702, approximately 67 years of age. The entry recording her death notes her registration number, her origin, and the word deceased. Nothing else. 52 years inside palace walls, reduced to a single line in a ledger. Asset logged out of the system. The Barbary pirates did not just take the people of Baltimore, they took the Irish relationship with the sea. For nearly 2 centuries after the raid, the village of Baltimore remained almost empty. The surviving settlers had already begun leaving by 1632, moving inland to Skibbereen and other towns. By the end of that decade, the harbor that had once supported a thriving pilchard fishery was largely abandoned. Reports of planned return raids circulated for years. The fear did not stay in Baltimore. It spread along the entire coast. Think about what it meant to live on the West Cork coast in 1635, in 1645, in 1660. Every morning the horizon had to be checked before the day could begin. Every unfamiliar sail had to be assessed, merchant or corsair, friendly or threat. The watchtowers that had existed before the raid acquired new urgency. Church bells, formerly called to prayer, were now also used as alarm systems. The rhythm of the sea, which had organized the working calendar for generations, which had meant food and income and life, now also meant the possibility of vanishing before sunrise. For generations, in communities along the Irish and English coasts, the horizon wasn't a view, it was a threat. Children were raised with the knowledge that the sea could take them, not by drowning, but by something worse, by men with chains who would sell you to a market on the other side of the world, and no one would come to bring you back. That understanding shapes a culture. It moves people inland. It empties fishing villages. It leaves ghost harbors that centuries later, archaeologists and historians have to work to explain. Why did people stop living here? The answer, often enough, is that they stopped feeling safe near the water. The historian Bernard Capp, in his 2022 Oxford University Press study of British slaves and Barbary corsairs, documents the economic devastation beyond the human toll. Families left destitute by the loss of their breadwinners. Entire maritime economies destabilized, commerce crippled, and, perhaps most remarkably, the political consequences that rippled upward. The monarch's repeated failure to protect coastal subjects helped polarize Parliament against the crown. The Barbary slave raids were not merely a coastal tragedy. They were one of the accelerants of the English Civil War. Baltimore itself was eventually resettled, slowly, tentatively, over decades. Today it is a small, beautiful village on Roaring Water Bay, with a pub called the Algiers Inn that acknowledges, with a kind of Irish directness, exactly what happened here. But the quiet of the harbor is a recovered quiet. For a long time it was a different kind of quiet, the quiet of a place that had been emptied by force and could not quite convince itself that the emptying was finished. When the Sack of Baltimore reached King Charles I, his response was fury. Orders were given, officials summoned, declarations made. A naval response was commissioned. And then, as had happened countless times before, the machinery of government processed the outrage and delivered, in the end, almost nothing that helped the people who had been taken. This was not new. The failure to protect coastal Europeans from corsair raids had been ongoing for over a century. The reasons were structural, economic, and deeply revealing about the gap between the people who held power and the people who paid for its failures. Europe in the 17th century was not a unified civilization capable of coordinated response. It was a continent in a state of sustained civil war. Protestants against Catholics, Spain against France, England lurching through its own constitutional crises, the Holy Roman Empire being systematically destroyed by the 30 Years' War. Every kingdom was watching its rivals more carefully than it was watching the southern horizon. A coordinated naval campaign against the Barbary states would have required trust and shared purpose that simply did not exist between nations that were currently killing each other's soldiers in Germany. More damaging still were the economic relationships that European powers maintained with the states enslaving their people. Venice needed access to Eastern Mediterranean markets. France had cultivated a strategic alliance with Istanbul to counterbalance the Habsburgs, meaning French kings were in active treaty relationships with the empire that was selling French sailors. Britain was simultaneously developing trade relationships with North African ports. The lives of fishermen from Baltimore were, in the cold calculus of statecraft, less valuable than the commercial lanes that passed through Algiers. And then there was another factor historians have been reluctant to examine with full honesty: the Europeans who actively helped. Between 1580 and 1680, an estimated 15,000 Christian Europeans converted to Islam and joined the Barbary operations. Half of all corsair captains in that period were renegades, former Europeans who had switched sides. They brought shipbuilding technology, navigation expertise, and intelligence about coastlines, harbors, and undefended villages. Without them, the corsairs could not have reached Iceland. Without Hackett, they might not have found Baltimore. This trade could not have functioned at the scale it did without European participation at every level, from individual pilots to government trade officials who looked the other way in exchange for commercial access. There was a ransoming system, the Trinitarians and Mercedarians, religious orders that collected charitable donations and sent agents to North Africa to negotiate for captives. It was an extraordinary institution. Priests walking into the slave markets of Algiers with bags of coin, trying to reverse by purchase what violence had created. But it reproduced the inequalities it was trying to remedy. Wealthy merchants could be ransomed quickly, within months sometimes. Middle-class families struggled but sometimes succeeded over years. The poor had almost no chance. A fisherman's wife taken from Baltimore in 1631, someone with no wealthy relatives, no church connections, no savings, could wait decades for a ransom that never came. Of the 107 people taken from Baltimore, only 3 ever returned to Ireland. One was freed quickly, likely among the more prosperous. 2 others returned only in 1646, 15 years after the raid. 15 years. The rest were gone, and the ransom system had no mechanism that could reach them. We began with a question: why did no one come to save them? And the answer, assembled from the records and silences of 300 years, is not satisfying. It is not the answer any civilization wants to give about itself. No one came because the women taken from Baltimore were poor, because they were settlers at the edge of a kingdom that had larger problems, because the trade routes through Algiers were worth more to European merchants than the lives of Irish fishermen's wives, because the nations that could have coordinated a response were too busy destroying each other to protect their own peripheries, because the ransom system, when it worked at all, worked for the wealthy, because the women who did return came home to a society that punished them for what had been done to them, whispered about, unmarriageable, carrying a stain they had never earned. Dutch archival sources contain the account of a woman ransomed after years in North Africa, who wrote in old age that she sometimes wished she had died there, because at least in Algiers, her suffering was hidden behind foreign walls. At home, it was public, and it followed her to her grave. This is not a story that belongs to one religion or one civilization. The machine that consumed the women of Baltimore was built and operated by Muslims and Christians alike, by Dutch renegades and Algerian governors and Ottoman officials and English politicians who preferred not to examine too closely what their trade relationships were subsidizing. It was a human machine, built by human decisions, maintained by human choices, and sustained by the human capacity to treat the suffering of distant strangers as an acceptable cost of doing business. The Barbary corsair system did not end because of a moral awakening. It ended because European naval power eventually outgrew the ability of the North African states to resist it. In 1816, a combined British and Dutch fleet bombarded Algiers. In 1830, France invaded Algeria outright, dismantling the last of the official corsair infrastructure and closing the public slave markets that had operated in the city's main squares for 3 centuries. By then, historians estimate between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans had been processed through the system. Most of them never returned. Their names are scattered through parish records and ransom petitions from Dublin to Dubrovnik. Often, all that survives is a single line: taken by Turks, lost to the Moors, vanished at sea. For the women, the record is even thinner: absorbed into households and harems, identified in ledgers by acquisition number rather than name, until one day the ledger stopped logging entries, and even the number disappeared. And here is where this history stops being ancient and starts pressing against the present. We often speak of slavery as something that happened over there, or to those people, as a specific and contained atrocity that belongs to other centuries and other continents. Baltimore dismantles that comfort. In 1631, the people taken from those thatched cottages were white, Christian, European, and living in a community that considered itself as civilized and as protected as any in the Western world. In the eyes of the global trafficking machine operating at that moment, they were simply inventory. Fair-skinned, age 19, asset 402. If the walls of your home were kicked in tonight, if men arrived speaking languages you had never heard and took everyone you loved onto ships heading toward a market you could not imagine, who would even know you were gone? How long before a government decided that retrieving you was less important than maintaining a trade relationship? How many Sundays before the priest stopped reading your name? That question is not ancient. It is alive right now. Modern human trafficking networks operate with the same structural logic as the Barbary corsairs: profit-driven, hierarchical, protected by the economic interests of powerful actors who benefit from looking the other way. The faces in the market are different. The ledgers are digital. The supply chains are global. The mechanisms of abandonment are the same. We have not solved this. We have updated the interface. The United Nations estimates that roughly 40 million people are living in conditions of modern slavery today: forced labor, debt bondage, sexual exploitation, domestic servitude. 40 million. And like the women of Baltimore, the overwhelming majority of them are poor. They come from places where disappearing does not trigger international headlines. They are taken by systems that are profit-driven and hierarchical, supported by layers of economic interest that make powerful actors reluctant to look too hard or act too decisively. John Hackett, the local pilot who sold his neighbors for his own freedom, has 1,000 modern equivalents. The corsair admiral who ran a clean, taxed, officially sanctioned operation from a fortified port city has modern equivalents too. The names and the geography have changed. The architecture of exploitation has not. This does not mean the past and the present are identical. It means that the past is not safely finished. History is not a cabinet you can lock and put away. The Sack of Baltimore is not a curiosity from a remote century. It is a diagram. It shows you what a trafficking system looks like when it is running at full efficiency, how it recruits local informants, how it processes captives into categories, how it generates paperwork that outlasts the people it describes, how it depends on the indifference of powerful governments who have other priorities, and how it eventually produces, in the communities it empties, a silence so complete that generations pass before anyone asks what happened here and why. History remembers wars and kings. It forgets the women dragged from their beds at 2 in the morning and loaded into ships that smelled of sulfur and burning thatch. It forgets the letters that broke off mid-sentence. It forgets the names read aloud from a pulpit in West Cork, year after year, until one Sunday the priest stopped reading them and the silence finally closed. You know this story now, the real one, the one with the smell of burning thatch and the thud of bare feet on wooden planks, and a wedding that was never held, and a name in an Ottoman ledger that recorded everything except the sound of a voice. The coasts of Ireland remember. The archives remember, in their own cold way. Now you do too. And that matters, because the crimes that live only in silence are the ones that can be repeated without consequence. The ones spoken aloud, examined without flinching, and refuse the comfort of forgetting, are the ones that carry a weight worth carrying forward. If this story moved you, if it showed you something in history you had never been shown before, share it. Forgotten crimes survive only when silence protects them. Subscribe to the channel if you want more buried history pulled back into the light. And drop a comment telling me which hidden chapter of this world you want us to uncover next.